Hello ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to talk about one of the first Japanese tanks we've discussed on this channel so far. It is known as the Type 3 Chinu, and even though this tank has never been in combat, I thought it would be fun to discuss. We also ran a poll which saw the Chinu come in second behind the Tiger 1, but eventually I decided against making a video about the Tiger 1 because it's been discussed a lot already and I wanted to do something different for this video. But before we start, I'd like to remind everyone to subscribe to my YouTube channel and leave a like if you enjoyed the video. Now let's get right into the video. The Japanese found that they didn't have an effective countermeasure against the M4 Sherman and the other allied tanks, so they wanted to build a tank which could go toe-to-toe with the allied tanks. This tank was supposed to be the Type 4 Cheeto, which was supposed to be the successor of the Chi-Ha tank, but this research and development took longer than expected. So they needed a temporary replacement, which eventually became the Chinu. The Chinu was the last design directly based on the Type 97 lineage. They decided to use the same chassis and suspension as the Type 1 Chi-Ha, but with the addition of an enlarged turret ring for the new large hexagonal gun turret with a commander's cupola. The Chinu didn't have an impressive armor thickness, but it was simplistic and easy to produce. At its thickest point it was only 50mm thick. The Chinu's main armament was a Type 3 75mm gun, which was one of the most powerful anti-tank guns Japan had to offer at that time. It had about a 90mm penetration power at the range of 100 meters and that decreased to 65mm over 1 kilometer. To put this into perspective, this would mean that they couldn't frontally knock out any tank we've discussed so far from 1 kilometer except for the Nashorn. There were about 75mm shells loaded into the tank. 30 of these were placed on the floor of the fighting compartment and the remaining 40 were placed in the turret. But like we discussed in the Tiger 2 video, this is a huge risk. If they penetrate your turret, the chance that your ammunition explodes is very much there, which could cause a lot of crew fatalities. The testing results of the Type 1 APHE shells were mediocre and did not meet the requirements of the cannon. To improve on this, the army developed a tungsten chromium steel anti-tank shell known as the Type 1 APHE Toko-Ko. This new shell improved the muzzle velocity to about 680 meters per second. Its secondary armament was one 7.7mm Type 97 machine gun. This was the standard machine gun for tanks and AFVs in general. One misconception is that it isn't related to the Type 97 aircraft machine gun used on the planes like the A6M0. Fun fact, actually the muzzle velocity of the machine gun is higher than the main armament. The muzzle velocity of the machine gun is about 724 meters per second and the muzzle velocity of the Type 3 75mm is 680 meters per second. The muzzle velocity isn't very quick when you compare it to the German 88mm which had a velocity speed of 981 meters per second, while the German Firefly would have a muzzle velocity of about 1200 meters per second when it used APDS rounds. However, it did have some slight advantages. For one, it was a rather small tank. It was only 5.6 meters long, 2.4 meters wide and almost 2.7 meters long. The advantage is that it's harder to hit and harder to spot as well. It was relatively light for a tank. It only weighed 18.8 tons, which makes it the lightest vehicle we've talked about. This makes moving these vehicles a lot easier. It had a Mitsubishi Type 100 air-cooled V12 engine. This engine produced 240 horsepower and allowed the tank to reach a top speed of 38.3 km an hour on the road. The transmission consisted of 4 forward gears and 1 reverse. Steering the vehicle was made possible due to the use of a clutch brake. The Chinu had an operational range of about 210 km if all components worked the way it was intended, which is still pretty good. On paper this sounds pretty bad, but we need to understand how these tanks were used. For the Japanese army, speed and agility were of high importance, since tanks were used for a variety of roles, from scouting to an infantry support tank. This meant that the tank had to be able to fire quickly and relocate to a new objective as fast as possible. When attacking strong anti-tank defenses, wave tactics were used. If the defenses were light, they would be masses forward. The infantry would follow closely behind the tanks, with artillery neutralizing defense with high explosive and smoke shells. In some instances, infantrymen rode the back of the tanks. Japanese tanks were also used in standalone operations, mostly reconnaissance, and combined arms fights. It was allocated to protect the Japanese homeland from an allied invasion which never came, so it never has seen any combat, because the Japanese surrendered before there was any invasion. They were part of a mobile shock force stationed on the third biggest island of Japan, named Kyushu. And some of them were camped near the Imperial Palace with the Emperor's Imperial Guard until the dissolution of the Empire. Anyway guys, that was it for today's video. Let me know your thoughts on this tank in the comment section down below. Like I said in the beginning, if you liked the video, please like and subscribe. We got a video recommendation on the left and a playlist recommendation on the right, so be sure to check that out and have a very good day.